When Timothy Hale appeared at the Mariposa County Sheriff's Station on a freezing cold morning, he was almost unrecognizable, gaunt, filthy clothes, eyes vacant, like he'd just stepped out from somewhere that didn't belong to the modern world. This man had vanished 2 years earlier during a hiking trip in Yosemite, a case once closed under the assumption he'd died somewhere in the mountains. But what made the officers uneasy wasn't his emaciated appearance or the sudden return. The most terrifying part was what Timothy began to describe about those 2 years, about the place where he'd been living, and about how a person could be kept without ever being physically confined. Some names and details have been changed to protect identities and privacy. Before diving into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. On the morning Timothy Hale started his trip, the parking lot at the Tuolumne Meadows area in Yosemite National Park carried the characteristic stillness of the high Sierra Nevada, where the open space and clear blue sky often create such a strong sense of safety that people easily let their guard down against hidden risks. Timothy, 36 years old, parked his car, turned off the engine, and locked the door one last time with the calm of someone accustomed to hiking solo, treating this outing more as a brief escape from urban life than a test of his limits. He grew up in a stable middle-class family, used to rules, plans, and control, so for Timothy this trip represented personal autonomy, a private space where he faced no pressure from work or social relationships. According to those present at the trailhead that morning, Timothy looked well prepared but not flashy, appropriate weather clothing, well-used trekking shoes, a medium-sized backpack holding enough food, water, paper maps and basic gear recommended by park management. There was no sign he planned to stray from marked trails, nor any equipment suggesting an adventurous scheme. Before setting out, Timothy completed his route registration at the ranger station, clearly noting his intended path around Tuolumne Meadows, overnight campsite, and expected return time the following afternoon, a schedule considered safe for someone with hiking experience in Yosemite. During the first few hours of his journey, Timothy was seen moving steadily along the trail, occasionally stopping for brief casual chats with other hikers, showing no signs of hurry or stress. The last confirmed sighting of him was at a junction where multiple trails intersected, a spot with wide visibility and frequent foot traffic. That day, Timothy made a short call to his family, saying he'd started the trip as planned, the weather was good, and he hadn't run into any issues. His voice calm, clear, carrying no trace of worry or unease. As scheduled, he was expected back by late afternoon the next day, with plenty of time to reach the city before dark. However, when that deadline passed, Timothy didn't show up at the trail's end, nor did he leave any message or call explaining the delay. At first, his family figured he might have extended the trip a few hours, or run into a minor phone signal issue, something not uncommon in Yosemite's high mountain areas. But as night fell, and every attempt to reach him went unanswered, the silence began to feel abnormal. By the next morning, with Timothy still completely out of contact and no confirmation from ranger stations that he'd left the area, worry turned into distinct unease. In the context of a tightly managed national park, with monitored trails and clear registration procedures, Timothy's failure to return on time and his disappearance from all communication channels crossed the line from ordinary delay, forcing his family into a difficult but unavoidable decision: contact the police and officially acknowledge that Timothy Hale had vanished in the heart of Yosemite without leaving any clue to explain his absence. Right after Timothy Hale's family officially reported that he had failed to return on the scheduled time as registered, the information was quickly forwarded to the Ranger Division of Yosemite National Park and classified as a high-priority missing person case due to his solo hiking activity in wilderness areas. Based on the route registration record, Timothy left at the Tuolumne Meadows Ranger Station. Park management confirmed that he had not completed the trip checkout procedure, and there was no record showing he had exited the area through any official trailheads. Within just a few hours of receiving the report, the park's standard search and rescue protocol was activated, involving highly trained search and rescue rangers, local volunteers experienced in the terrain, and a medical team ready to respond if the subject was found alive. The initial search phase focused on sweeping the entire trail system, Timothy was expected to have followed, including any accessible side branches within the time frame of his disappearance, under the primary assumption that he might have gotten lost, suffered an injury, or been forced to stop due to environmental factors. Ground search teams were deployed in small groups, moving slowly and systematically, checking every section of trail, rest areas, informal campsites, and high-risk spots such as steep slopes, rock crevices, and riverbanks. At the same time, the park mobilized helicopters for aerial searches, using long-range observation equipment to spot any anomalies on the ground, including slide marks, brightly colored clothing, or any movement that could be human-related. During the sweeps, search teams noted several personal items believed to belong to Timothy, scattered along a section of side trail, a used water bottle, a piece of food packaging, and one small non-essential item, all showing no signs of heavy damage or forceful impact. These finds were initially seen as positive leads, suggesting Timothy might have passed through that area after his last confirmed sighting. However, the fact that the items were scattered rather than concentrated at one specific point made it difficult for searchers to determine his next direction of travel. Notably, there were no signs whatsoever of a serious accident or obvious violence at the scenes, no blood, no signs of struggle, and no torn clothing or destroyed gear, elements that typically appear in cases of severe injury or attack. This caused the hypotheses of a wildlife attack or a fall from significant height to be temporarily ranked as low priority in the early phase. Over many consecutive days, the search area was gradually expanded beyond the registered trail, reaching into more complex terrain that ordinary hikers rarely access, in hopes of finding additional clues that could lead to Timothy's location. Search teams consistently recorded relatively stable weather conditions, with no heavy rain or unusual natural events during the period of Timothy's disappearance, which reduced the likelihood that he had been swept away or that his tracks had been obscured by environmental factors. Nevertheless, after many days of effort involving dozens of personnel and modern support equipment, the initial search operation still yielded no decisive results. No additional personal items were discovered, no signals came from any locator devices, and no new witnesses came forward to confirm seeing Timothy after the last recorded time. Faced with the reality that the entire high-priority area had been thoroughly swept without strong enough clues to pinpoint the victim's location, park management was forced to scale back direct search efforts and shift the case to monitored status, while Timothy's family had to confront an initial conclusion filled with uncertainty. In one of the most tightly monitored national parks in the United States, Timothy Hale had vanished without leaving any clear trace to explain what had happened to him in those first days after losing contact. As the first few days of searching passed without yielding any decisive clues, Yosemite National Park management, along with involved agencies, were forced to adjust their approach to Timothy Hale's disappearance in line with established protocols for cases where the victim's location remains undetermined in wilderness environments. The scope of direct searching was gradually narrowed, not because rescue teams believed all possibilities had been exhausted, but because the vast majority of highest probability areas had already been swept multiple times with dense coverage, yet still produced no new signs. Search and rescue teams shifted from expanding the perimeter to conducting selective checks of overlooked spots, focusing on areas with complex or hard-to-access terrain that couldn't be fully covered in the initial phase due to safety limitations. Alongside the adjustment of scope, rescue and medical experts began reassessing Timothy's survival odds based on collected data, including weather conditions in the days following his disappearance, the amount of food and water he carried, and the terrain characteristics of the area. Although initial weather was recorded as stable, the reality of Yosemite's high mountain environment, sharp temperature swings between day and night combined with rugged terrain, made the likelihood of a missing person sustaining themselves long-term without leaving traces increasingly low. These analyses were documented cautiously in internal reports, with emphasis that not finding Timothy did not equate to confirming the worst outcome, yet it also did not permit maintaining the level of optimism seen in the early days. After compiling all unsuccessful search results From ground, aerial, and technical support measures, park management prepared a detailed report listing every checked area, every personal item discovered, and every hypothesis considered. The report painted a consistent but deeply unsettling picture. Timothy appeared to have vanished from his registered trail, without any indication of a sudden event or obvious violence. Based on that data, the initial conclusion leaned toward the possibility that Timothy suffered a terrain-related accident outside the search team's line of sight, perhaps a slip and fall in a blind spot, a deep rock crevice, or a hard-to-reach section where visual detection on foot or from the air faced significant limitations. This was a technical conclusion rather than a definitive assertion, used primarily to explain why no further clues emerged despite large-scale deployment. More importantly, throughout the entire evaluation process, authorities found insufficient evidence to open a criminal investigation, as there were no signs of third-party involvement, no reports of suspicious behavior in the area at the time of Timothy's disappearance, and no physical traces suggesting coercion or assault. The absence of these elements meant the case did not meet the legal threshold required to shift toward criminal inquiry, even though Timothy's family continued to hold hope that he might still be alive somewhere. After consulting opinions from multiple specialized departments and completing necessary procedures, the case was officially reclassified from an active search and rescue operation to a cold missing person file, an administrative term reflecting the reality that all active search efforts had been temporarily halted due to a lack of viable leads to pursue. This decision was not made lightly. It came with difficult conversations with Timothy's family, during which park representatives explained that the file would remain on record, any new information would be received and evaluated, but large-scale search campaigns would not resume without specific grounds. For the authorities, this was a procedurally appropriate step. For Timothy's family, it marked a new and deeply painful phase, where waiting was no longer tied to the sound of helicopters or the footsteps of rescue teams, but shifted to a prolonged silence, in which his disappearance was documented on paper as an unsolved missing person case, closed operationally, yet still open in terms of questions, left hanging between the assumption of an accident and the things that could not be determined. Nearly 2 years after the day Timothy Hale disappeared from Yosemite National Park, a quiet morning at the Mariposa Town Sheriff's Station was shattered when a man stepped through the front door in a condition that immediately caught the attention of the on-duty officers. He was so gaunt that the bone structure showed clearly beneath his darkened skin. The clothes draped over him were old, filthy, and reeked of mildew, as if they'd been exposed to rain and sun countless times without proper washing, sleeves frayed and torn at the cuffs, pant legs crusted with dried mud. The man's hair was long and matted, clumped into patches, with small scraped areas visible on his scalp. His fingernails were cracked and blackened from long accumulated grime. He moved slowly, each step cautious, shoulders slumped, head slightly bowed, eyes unfocused, and constantly darting around the room as if trying to make sense of where he was. When an officer approached to ask what was going on, the man took several seconds to respond, as though it required time to process the question, then answered in a hoarse, low, halting voice, pausing at times to catch his breath. His replies were fragmented and disjointed, often breaking off mid-sentence, making communication difficult from the start. When asked to present identification, he shook his head, hands trembling slightly, eyes showing clear confusion, saying he had no wallet, no papers of any kind, no phone, and no other personal items beyond the clothes on his back. Questions about why he was in Mariposa yielded no clearer information. The man spoke in circles, sometimes falling into long silences, sometimes answering with disconnected phrases that didn't form complete sentences. When asked about the current date, he gave incorrect time references, mixing up years, revealing severe disorientation regarding time. During the conversation, officers noted numerous abnormal behaviors. The man's eyes frequently appeared vacant, reactions were slow to surrounding stimuli, he sometimes startled at the sound of a closing door or footsteps, and he tended to avoid direct eye contact. When questions turned to basic personal information, the man stayed silent for a long while, seemingly struggling with his own memories. Before uttering a name, Timothy Hale. The sound came out weakly, slowly, as if each word needed careful weighing before being spoken, and his face briefly showed an indefinable expression, tense yet guarded. The officers immediately recognized the name as matching a missing person file once archived in the regional system, but that coincidence alone wasn't enough to confirm the identity of the man standing before them right away. When pressed for more details to clarify, he couldn't provide a complete former address, only mentioning vague place names without specificity, and he also couldn't accurately recall the job he'd once held. Questions about family, relatives, or closest friends received hesitant, sparse answers, at times contradictory to what he'd said moments earlier. Throughout the entire interaction, the man frequently paused mid-sentence, raising a hand to his forehead, or rubbing his temples as if trying to concentrate, but the harder he tried, the more disjointed his speech became. Officers observed clear signs of dehydration, cracked dry lips, wrinkled skin, along with extreme fatigue, indicating he'd endured a prolonged period under harsh living conditions. The complete absence of any identification made confirming who he was depend entirely on his self-identification and outward appearances, while his unstable mental state reduced the reliability of the information he provided. There were no signs of alcohol intoxication or stimulant use at the time of his appearance, but the confusion about time, place, and memory led officers to note the possibility that the man was suffering from prolonged physical exhaustion or severe psychological trauma. In their initial notes, they described his face as emaciated and far older looking than the age recorded in Timothy Hale's file, skin darkened and wrinkled, eyes sunken with prominent dark circles, giving the impression he'd lived through years of hardship, far beyond a normal existence. The man's sudden appearance drew attention not just because of his claimed identity, but also because his overall condition suggested a long period cut off from basic societal living conditions, with no signs of medical care or stable support. In the confined space of the Mariposa Sheriff's Station, every detail from his gait, his eyes, his voice, to the prolonged silences was carefully observed and recorded, because each small sign could hold significant meaning in understanding who this man really was and what had brought him here in such a state. After the man who identified himself as Timothy Hale was taken into a private work area at the Mariposa Sheriff's Station, officers proceeded with identity verification steps in accordance with protocols for cases involving no identification documents and potential connection to a prior missing person file. The first step was collecting fingerprints, a process carried out carefully due to the man's severely deteriorated physical condition. His fingertips were dry and rough, with many cracks and peeling skin, making it harder than usual to obtain clear prints. After several adjustments and cleaning of the skin surface, technicians finally managed to capture a set of fingerprints of sufficient quality to enter into the California State Comparison System. While awaiting results, the man was asked to sit and rest, provided with drinking water, and monitored for basic health status, as officers continued to review existing data related to unresolved missing person cases in the Yosemite area and surrounding regions. The fingerprint comparison results later came back, showing a clear match with the record of Timothy Hale, who had been reported missing nearly 2 years earlier at Yosemite National Park, confirming that the man present at the station was indeed the individual who had vanished during a legally registered hiking trip. To further solidify this conclusion, police continued with dental record checks, a verification method commonly used when an individual's appearance has changed significantly over time. Based on dental data archived from Timothy's prior medical records, specialists compared tooth structure, filling locations, and other unique features against the man's current condition, and the results showed near-perfect correspondence, ruling out any possibility of mistaken identity. In parallel with the technical steps, police contacted Timothy's family to inform them that a man claiming to be him had appeared and was in the process of verification. This communication was handled with great caution, avoiding any firm assertions until all necessary data had been fully verified. The family was asked to provide additional identifying details, including physical characteristics, old scars, and medical history, to assist with the comparison process. As these details were successively confirmed to match the man at the station, the possibility that this was not Timothy Hale was almost entirely eliminated. Final confirmation came when the biometric data and personal records all aligned, officially establishing the man's identity as Timothy Hale, the person who had been listed as missing in the system for nearly 2 years. Immediately after identity confirmation, officers documented Timothy's initial health condition in detail, including significant weight loss compared to prior records, signs of malnutrition, dehydration, and a mix of old and new scratches and abrasions on his skin, indicating he had endured a long period under inadequate living conditions. Heart rate, blood pressure, and neurological reflexes were preliminarily checked, showing his body was in a state of severe fatigue, but with no immediate life-threatening signs requiring emergency intervention on site. Cognitively, Timothy still displayed some confusion about time and the sequence of events, though when asked about his name and certain basic personal information, he began responding more quickly than upon initial arrival. Officers noted that confirming his identity did not equate to clarifying what had happened to Timothy during the entire period he was missing, but it provided a crucial foundation for handling the case along proper legal and administrative lines. On the basis of this confirmation, Timothy Hale's missing person file was officially reopened in the system, shifting from archive status to active, allowing authorities to continue gathering information related to his prolonged disappearance. Reopening the file was not merely an update to data, it also marked a shift in the approach to the case, as Timothy's presence confirmed that previous assumptions about his fate no longer aligned with reality. In internal reports, police clearly stated that the identity had been verified through multiple independent sources, ruling out fabrication or error, while emphasizing that Timothy's current physical and mental health required close monitoring in the period ahead. Timothy's family, after receiving official notification, expressed intense emotion at the news that he was alive, but officers refrained from offering any opinions on the cause or circumstances of his long absence, focusing instead on completing verification procedures and updating records in accordance with regulations. The entire identity verification process was carried out continuously over many hours, with tight coordination among technical, administrative, and medical units, to ensure the final conclusion rested not on emotion or speculation, but on objective data systems and thorough cross-checking. Once all comparison steps were complete, Timothy Hale was officially confirmed as the individual who had gone missing at Yosemite, meaning the file no longer concerned identifying an unknown person, but instead documented the return of a victim in a state of extreme exhaustion, necessitating a complete re-evaluation of everything that had occurred during the time he was gone. On that basis, priority was immediately shifted from administrative procedures to medical care, and Timothy was taken to the nearest treatment facility for a comprehensive physical evaluation to determine the actual extent of bodily damage after nearly 2 years of unexplained absence, where signs of severe emaciation began to become clearly evident right from the initial checks. The general examination recorded that Timothy had lost a significant amount of weight compared to his prior medical records, with his body mass index dropping below the safe threshold, clear muscle atrophy in his arms, thighs, and shoulders reflecting a prolonged energy deficit rather than acute weight loss over a short period. Doctors noted that subcutaneous fat had almost disappeared in many areas. His skin was dry, lacking elasticity, with patches of flaking and small cracks indicating chronic dehydration and nutrient deficiency. Initial blood analysis showed imbalanced electrolytes, low protein levels, deficiencies in B and D vitamins, along with mild anemia, all consistent with a long-term unstable and inadequate diet. Notably, Timothy's malnutrition state did not fully align with the pattern typically seen in individuals surviving independently in mountain forest environments, as the degree of deficiency in certain essential micronutrients suggested he had no access to a diverse food supply, even those sources that could normally be found in nature with basic survival skills. When assessing the musculoskeletal system, doctors noted widespread muscle weakness, slowed reflexes, and significantly reduced grip strength, while his knee and ankle joints showed stiffness and limited range of motion, suggesting a lack of free movement or the need to maintain disadvantageous postures for extended periods. On the skin beyond in completely healed old abrasions, there were unevenly distributed faint scar areas, some showing signs of prolonged dermatitis from high humidity exposure or repeated friction, not corresponding to wounds typically seen in people constantly moving through mountainous forest terrain. Particularly, Timothy's hands and feet lacked the characteristic calluses of someone who regularly climbed or hiked long distances over rough terrain for extended periods. Instead, the skin was soft, weak, and easily damaged, prompting doctors to question the actual level of physical activity he had engaged in during the time he was missing. When comparing the overall medical findings to the hypothesis of Timothy's long-term survival in a wilderness environment, many inconsistencies began to emerge clearly. People forced to survive in the forest often show certain adaptive signs such as muscle development in the lower limbs, call-used hands and feet, and characteristic injuries from contact with plants, insects, or terrain, whereas Timothy's condition indicated limited movement and environmental exposure. Additionally, some of his biological markers reflected an irregular but repetitive daily rhythm, as if his body had adapted to a schedule lacking natural light or unchanging environment for a prolonged time, something unlikely if he had been continuously moving in open spaces. Doctors also noted mild bone density reduction, a sign often linked to prolonged lack of weight-bearing activity or sunlight exposure, further reinforcing suspicion that Timothy's living environment during his disappearance was not the free outdoor conditions many imagined. When examining old wounds, there were no signs of serious injuries from major terrain accidents such as untreated fractures or joint deformities, which did not align with the hypothesis of him having fallen from height or suffered a serious accident and then self-recovered in the forest. Instead, Timothy's body bore the marks of gradual wear and tear, like a slow erosion process under conditions of deprivation and restriction, rather than acute injuries. Some areas of skin on his wrists and ankles showed hyperpigmentation and faint circular scars, not clear enough for a definitive medical conclusion, but sufficient to make doctors note and record them as abnormalities requiring further monitoring. Timothy's oral health was also evaluated, showing gum inflammation, enamel erosion, and signs of prolonged lack of care, but no damage from chewing hard objects or sand and dirt, which is often seen in people relying on raw natural foods. Summarizing the results, the medical team concluded that Timothy's physical condition reflected a long period of living in an environment lacking nutritional security, restricted movement, and insufficient natural light, with a certain degree of control or constraint over daily activities. The indicators did not match the scenario of free independent survival, making the hypothesis that Timothy lived alone in the forest for nearly 2 years less convincing from a medical standpoint. Instead, the objective data from his body suggested that his living environment during the disappearance may have been enclosed, with limited space and access to resources, an observation carefully recorded in the medical file without speculation beyond professional scope. These questions were not intended to reach a final conclusion, but they created an important foundation for understanding that Timothy's condition was not simply the result of getting lost in the forest, but reflected a prolonged series of abnormal living conditions that needed to be seriously considered in the overall context of the case. After Timothy Hale's health condition had temporarily stabilized enough for short periods of communication, investigators proceeded to take his initial statement about the time he was missing, with the goal of gathering as much raw information as possible before fatigue or psychological stress could further affect his memories. Right from the first answers, Timothy's account showed clear breaks in the sequence of time. He couldn't precisely determine when he had left the trail, only describing a feeling of going off course that happened after many hours of moving, but he couldn't tie that event to any specific day or hour. When asked how long his disappearance had lasted, Timothy gave conflicting estimates, sometimes saying just a few months, other times claiming he had gone through many cold seasons, but he couldn't identify the number of season changes or specific years, showing severe disruption in his perception of time. Investigators noted that Timothy often mixed up the seasons of the year, describing details that didn't fit, such as prolonged cold weather during periods that should have been summer in Yosemite, or very limited daylight during times when the area typically has long days. When asked to describe the sequence of events after he left the trail, Timothy's narrative did not follow a linear thread. He jumped from one detail to another, without clear connections, sometimes circling back to repeat the same image with slight variations, making it difficult to determine which parts were actual events and which might be blended memories. Some sections of his statement contained long silences, during which Timothy seemed to be trying to recall but couldn't, then continued with vague phrases like "everything just kept repeating," or "I don't know how long it was." When investigators tried to pinpoint the specific location where Timothy had spent most of his missing time, he couldn't provide a clear geographic description. His answers stayed at very general features like inside a house, no windows, or a very narrow place, but without enough detail to match any identifiable location in or around Yosemite. Descriptions of the space often contradicted each other, sometimes conveying a sense of being closed and dark, other times mentioning faint artificial light, but no standout characteristic was prominent enough to narrow it down. When asked how he moved between locations, Timothy appeared confused, sometimes saying he didn't go anywhere, other times hinting at short movements but unable to recall by what means or for how long. Investigators also noted many distinct memory gaps, especially around the early and late stages of the missing period. Timothy couldn't clearly remember how he had left Yosemite, nor could he specifically explain why he ended up in Mariposa in his current condition. These gaps weren't limited to minor details but covered major milestones as well, making even the reconstruction of a minimal timeline challenging. When asked about other people who might have interacted with him during the time he was missing, Timothy gave vague responses, unable to name anyone, only describing fragmented images of one person or someone, but he couldn't provide consistent identifying characteristics. At certain points, his statement contained internal contradictions, for example, describing an enclosed space yet mentioning strong wind sounds outside, or saying he saw no natural light, but recounting changes between light and dark in ways without a clear source. Investigators noted that Timothy frequently had to pause to adjust his answers, sometimes correcting what he'd said just minutes earlier, not with signs of deliberate concealment, but more like someone trying to piece together memories that were no longer intact. When directly asked about the possibility of surviving alone in the forest for such a long time, Timothy couldn't offer a clear explanation, only repeating that everything wasn't like what I thought in my head at first, a statement that provided no specific information, but indicated a discrepancy between expectation and actual experience. The entire initial statement was recorded with extreme caution, as investigators recognized that his physical exhaustion and signs of cognitive disruption could significantly impact the accuracy of his memories. No part of the account was detailed or consistent enough to allow independent verification at that time, nor were there any specific dates, locations, or events that could be immediately cross-checked against objective data. Official notes indicated that Timothy's statement, while clearly reflecting his subjective perceptions of the missing period, still contained many unfillable gaps, significant timeline distortions, and a lack of necessary identifying details, making the content insufficient as a reliable foundation for any specific investigative conclusions at that stage, and recording it only as a preliminary account, to be cross-referenced later when additional objective data became available, or when his cognitive state allowed for more stable information. While the preliminary statement was archived for later analysis, the focus of handling shifted to assessing Timothy's mental state, and he was placed into an in-depth psychological evaluation process to determine the extent of trauma, as well as the lasting impact of experiences he could not yet fully describe in words, where experts quickly recognized signs that went far beyond ordinary stress responses. PTSD screening was conducted according to standard clinical criteria, focusing on reactions to traumatic memories, emotional regulation ability, and hypervigilance levels, and Timothy displayed many matching indicators, including strong startle responses to unexpected sounds, changes in breathing when asked about certain specific topics, and a tendency to withdraw when feeling pressed by targeted questions. However, what particularly caught the experts' attention was not just the presence of PTSD symptoms, but the way they manifested in a distinct pattern, rather than explosive emotional outbursts or complete avoidance of recall. Timothy often fell into prolonged silences, with lowered gaze and a contracted body posture, as though waiting for permission to continue speaking. In behavioral reflex tests, he showed an unusually high level of compliance, frequently asking if his answers were correct or allowed to be said, even when there was no imposing requirement from the evaluator. When guided through hypothetical exercises to assess independent decision-making ability, Timothy appeared confused, slow, and inclined to wait for the next instruction, rather than actively making choices, a behavior inconsistent with his prior personal profile, which described an independent adult, capable of clear decision-making. During the exchanges, experts noted that Timothy selectively avoided certain topics, especially questions related to relationships with others, during the missing period or situations where he might have faced external authority or control. When these topics were raised, he often redirected answers to neutral or generalized details, sometimes responding with short, emotionless sentences or remaining completely silent for extended periods. In contrast, when asked about environmental factors not tied to people, such as light, space, or daily routines, Timothy provided more detailed responses, showing a clear separation between memories he could access and those that were blocked. Another notable point was the absence of proactive escape behaviors in Timothy's account. He did not describe ongoing efforts to flee, seek help, or resist, but instead frequently spoke of waiting, doing what needed to be done, or keeping everything stable, phrases reflecting a psychological state oriented toward maintaining equilibrium, rather than seeking freedom. Experts assessed that this pattern did not align with the instinctive survival responses typically seen in people trapped in wilderness environments or short-term dangerous situations, but was closer to psychological adaptation under prolonged controlled conditions. In deeper analysis of power dynamics and dependency tests, Timothy showed a tendency to tie his sense of safety to compliance with unspoken rules, even though he could not clearly articulate what those rules were or who had set them. He often reacted with anxiety when asked to imagine voluntarily leaving a familiar space, even in non-threatening hypothetical scenarios, indicating signs of long-formed psychological dependency. These manifestations were reinforced by Timothy's difficulty in identifying personal desires, frequently answering, "I don't know," or "it doesn't matter," when asked about his own needs, plans, or emotions, a trait commonly seen in individuals accustomed to having personal needs downplayed or controlled by external factors. In emotional memory assessments, Timothy tended to clearly recall feelings of anxiety, fear of being wrong, or fear of doing something incorrectly, but he could not clearly recall the origins of those feelings, creating a psychological picture where reactions persisted even as specific memories had faded or been pushed out of consciousness. Summarizing the collected data, the psychological experts offered an initial assessment that Timothy was not only dealing with trauma symptoms following a prolonged experience, but also exhibited classic signs of long-term mental control, where compliance, avoidance, and dependency had been gradually reinforced over time. This assessment was not based on a single manifestation, but on a consistent combination of behavior, emotional reflexes, and the way Timothy processed information related to personal autonomy. The experts noted that these signs required further monitoring and evaluation, but at the present time, they indicated that Timothy's psychological state reflected a prolonged adaptation to an environment, with controlling elements, going beyond what could be explained by acute stress or isolated trauma, and creating an important foundation for understanding that what he had endured had not only affected his body, but had also left deep imprints on his psychological structure and behavior. After Timothy Hale's initial statement was fully recorded, investigators proceeded with detailed analysis by cross-referencing what he described against actual field conditions in Yosemite and surrounding areas, starting with the most basic elements such as terrain, distances, and accessibility. Timothy's vague descriptions of his living space during the missing period, including a sense of restricted visibility, inability to clearly locate himself relative to natural landmarks, and the absence of direct natural light did not match the characteristics of open mountain forest areas, where even deep forest locations still have clear day-night cycles and varying visibility depending on terrain. When comparing his statements about time and environmental conditions to historical weather data for the Yosemite area during the presumed period of his disappearance, numerous mismatches began to emerge. He described prolonged continuous cold periods with a lack of distinct seasonal transitions, whereas meteorological records showed fairly clear seasonal temperature and weather variations throughout those 2 years. Investigators also noted that Timothy mentioned no direct exposure to rain, snow, or strong winds for extended periods, something highly unlikely if a person had been living outdoors or moving frequently in the high Sierra Nevada environment. When cross-referencing the sounds Timothy reported hearing, such as regular repetitive noises, independent of weather, with the reality of a natural environment that constantly changes, experts concluded that these sounds were likely not originating from an open space. Comparing his statement to natural light data also revealed inconsistencies. Timothy spoke of difficulty distinguishing day from night over long periods, while even the densest forested areas of Yosemite still experience significant light changes according to the day-night cycle. Further inconsistencies emerged when investigators examined the possibility that Timothy had voluntarily secluded himself or lived in isolation in the forest. If that had been the case, his account should have reflected active survival behaviors, such as foraging for food, building shelter, adapting to weather, and navigating terrain. But these elements were almost entirely absent or mentioned only vaguely without detail. In addition, previously recorded medical data showed that Timothy's body lacked the characteristic adaptations of long-term wilderness survival, further ruling out the possibility of voluntary long-term seclusion without external support. When analyzing the timelines Timothy provided, investigators observed a clear discrepancy between his subjective perception and objective reality. Periods he described as short corresponded to months-long phases, while what he portrayed as prolonged seemed to be brief events, indicating a systematic distortion in time perception. This distortion did not appear random, but clustered around periods when he described having to follow fixed daily routines, heightening suspicion that his living environment during the disappearance involved high control. Investigators also compared Timothy's statement to previously documented cases of missing persons who returned after periods of captivity, noting many similarities in descriptions of lost personal agency, dependence on external schedules, and fragmented memories with hard-to-explain gaps. Ruling out voluntary seclusion was not based on a single factor, but resulted from synthesizing multiple independent data points from the statement, medical records, environmental and weather analysis, all pointing to the scenario of Timothy voluntarily choosing to live isolated in the forest for nearly 2 years as incompatible with reality. On that basis, investigators began to establish the hypothesis that Timothy had been held in an enclosed environment where elements such as light, time, and space were controlled, leading to profound changes in his perception and behavior. This hypothesis was constructed cautiously, not to rush to conclusions, but to provide the most reasonable explanation for the contradictions between his statement and objective data. Once the captivity hypothesis took shape, the approach to the case shifted accordingly. Rather than continuing to treat it as a disappearance due to terrain accident or personal choice, investigators began examining the possibility of third-party intervention during the time Timothy was missing. This change was not made public, but within internal handling, it marked a clear turning point in the case approach, as the central question no longer revolved around which part of the forest Timothy had gotten lost in, but shifted to how he had been held in a specific place, under what living conditions, and under whose control. As the signs pointing to the existence of an enclosed captivity environment grew increasingly consistent across Timothy's statement, medical evaluation results, and field data, the investigative direction was adjusted to focus on reconstructing a hypothetical timeline with the aim of clarifying the key phases during the period Timothy was missing, particularly the point at which he lost personal autonomy over his own movement. This began by reviewing the last confirmed moments when Timothy was still actively in control during his hiking journey. cross-referencing them with his fragmented descriptions of a sudden going off-course feeling and losing direction that appeared abruptly, thereby narrowing down a short window of time where his autonomy may have been interrupted. Investigators noted that Timothy did not describe any prolonged wandering process or continuous chain of survival decisions, but only mentioned a vague transitional phase followed by a prolonged passive state, suggesting that the loss of movement control occurred relatively early and suddenly. Based on that, they analyzed the period of Timothy's isolation by combining his subjective sense of repetitive daily routines with objective data, such as the degree of malnutrition and biological markers, reflecting prolonged lack of natural light and physical activity. These data allowed estimation that the majority of Timothy's missing time took place under spatially restricted conditions with very low mobility, rather than interspersed periods of free movement, as in an outdoor survival scenario. From establishing the prolonged isolation state, investigators proceeded to reconstruct a hypothetical daily schedule based on details Timothy inadvertently revealed in his statement, such as eating at fixed times, sleeping and waking, without reliance on natural light, and the monotonous repetition of daily activities. This schedule revealed a highly controlled structure, where time markers did not vary with seasons or environmental conditions, something incompatible with free outdoor life, but consistent with an enclosed or semi-enclosed space. Once the hypothetical schedule took shape, investigators used it to narrow potential holding locations by eliminating places incapable of sustaining such a stable environment over a long period. Deep forest areas, open terrain, or locations heavily influenced by weather were ruled out first, as they could not provide the stability in temperature, light, and sound that Timothy described. Similarly, areas near heavily trafficked trails or high-density residential zones were excluded due to the low likelihood of maintaining absolute isolation for an extended time. The elimination process continued by considering makeshift or spontaneous structures in the forest, such as abandoned tents or unused cabins, but most of these sites failed to meet criteria for long-term concealment, light control, and external sound restriction. Investigators also analyzed the possibility that Timothy was held at a location with limited connectivity, but still capable of accessing a stable supply source, based on his malnutrition profile, showing deficiencies, but not total depletion, suggesting food provision was repetitive and minimal, rather than entirely random, as in free survival. As unsuitable areas were progressively eliminated, the scope of suspicion narrowed around locations sharing common characteristics, enclosed, minimally affected by weather, capable of maintaining an artificial routine, and situated far enough from main routes to avoid attention. This zoning was not based on a single specific point, but on a set of geographic and environmental criteria, applied simultaneously, to identify the highest probability areas meeting all conditions, suggested by Timothy's statement, and medical data. During the timeline reconstruction, investigators also paid attention to gaps in Timothy's memory, particularly the early phase when he lost movement control, treating these as indicators that the initiating event may have involved a stunning factor or intense psychological pressure, resulting in incomplete memory encoding. These gaps were marked on the hypothetical timeline as points that could not be precisely determined, but were still placed in logical relation to the subsequent prolonged isolation phases. The entire timeline reconstruction was not intended to recreate every specific day, but to identify the overall structure of the missing period, from the moment Timothy lost personal autonomy, through the extended isolation phase, up to when that controlled state ended. This hypothetical timeline became a crucial analytical tool, allowing investigators to shift from examining disconnected possibilities to a coherent logical model, where each physical, psychological, and environmental element was placed in its proper relative position within the nearly 2 years that Timothy had been missing. Based on the hypothetical timeline that had been reconstructed, investigators shifted their focus to tracing potential related locations by conducting a detailed analysis of maps of the western and northwestern edges of Yosemite, where the terrain transitions from the tightly managed park zones into federal lands, private property, and administrative buffer areas with lower levels of oversight. The analysis process did not stop at examining geographic distances, but also concentrated on factors such as discrete access from secondary trails, the degree of forest cover, environmental condition stability, and the ability to sustain long-term habitation without drawing attention. Investigators evaluated areas with minimal administrative control, where boundaries between public and private land were not clearly marked, often experiencing unauthorized residency or unregistered use, particularly properties lying outside the regular patrol range of Yosemite rangers. During the review, they cross-referenced data from local agencies on sites previously recorded for unpermitted construction, makeshift structures, or long-standing buildings without official registration records, as such locations had a high likelihood of meeting the criteria for enclosure and low surveillance. Investigators also gathered information from land tax records, building permits and civil reports related to areas that had experienced land use disputes or long-term abandonment to identify exploitable management gaps. In parallel with document analysis, authorities collected information from the local community, including neighboring landowners, forest workers, and sparsely settled residents on the park's fringes, focusing on reports of unusual structures appearing, abnormal nighttime lights, or signs of irregular but persistent habitation. Many sources mentioned several old wooden structures, deep in the forest with no official grid electricity connection, and rare foot traffic, but most of these locations, when cross-checked, did not fully meet the criteria for maintaining a stable environment over an extended period. The screening process continued with checks on little-used dirt roads, obscured entry points, and properties with terrain sufficiently concealed to limit external visibility, while still allowing motorized vehicle access without leaving obvious traces. During this process, an isolated wooden cabin began to draw particular attention from investigators due to its location outside regular patrol boundaries, far from the nearest residential area, and its absence from official district building registration records. The structure was described as a single standalone wooden house, situated amid dense forest, accessed via a narrow dirt road, easily obscured by vegetation, with indications of long-term use despite no clear infrastructure connections. Indirect reports from nearby residents noted that the area around the wooden cabin rarely showed external communication, with no confirmed permanent occupants, but occasional signs of activity, such as thin smoke at irregular times or sounds emanating at night. When cross-referencing these features with the criteria established from Timothy's statement, medical data, and psychological analysis, investigators observed significant alignment regarding the potential to maintain an enclosed space, control light, and limit exposure to the external environment. Additionally, the cabin's location fell within a reasonable travel range from points where Timothy may have initially lost control of movement, consistent with the estimated distances and timeframes in the hypothetical timeline. Investigators reviewed records related to the property's ownership and found numerous ambiguities in its legal status, including a lack of updated resident information and no records of periodic inspections by relevant authorities. These factors placed the wooden cabin on the priority investigation list, not as a definitive conclusion, but as a suspect location that fully met the established criteria. Placing this site under investigation triggered subsequent preparatory steps to gather additional objective information, from assessing the surrounding environment and verifying usage history, to planning an appropriate approach, and in the overall picture of the case, this isolated wooden cabin emerged as a convergence point for multiple independent data streams, making it the central focus in efforts to trace locations related to the period Timothy Hale had been missing. After the isolated wooden cabin was placed on the priority investigation list, authorities conducted a systematic on-site examination, beginning with an overall survey of the structure and surrounding environment to determine its degree of fit with the hypotheses already formed. The wooden cabin was built in a simple style, single-story, with walls of aged pieced-together wood, a low roof, no large windows facing outward, but only small ventilation openings sufficient for air circulation, while maximally limiting visibility from inside to outside. The sole main entrance was a thick wooden door, showing no signs of reinforcement, with special locks or complex metal bolts, indicating the place was not designed as a confinement space in the traditional physical sense. Inside, investigators noted signs of prolonged regular habitation. The floor had clear wear marks along fixed paths, wooden surfaces darkened from frequent contact, and a characteristic damp smell of a low ventilation space used over a long period. Furniture in the house was sparse, mainly basic items for daily living, arranged neatly and orderly, without signs of clutter or constant relocation. As they moved deeper inside, investigators discovered the space divided into two distinct living areas, clearly separated by function, but not divided by hard physical barriers. One area included a small dining table, a simple kitchen, and a standard-sized bed, fully equipped with personal items and showing frequent use, while the other area at the rear was smaller, less lit, and had only minimal living supplies, indicating a clear difference in living conditions. The coexistence of these two areas suggested that at least two different daily rhythms had taken place within the same space, with unequal levels of comfort and resource access. Notably, throughout the entire wooden cabin, investigators found no physical restraint measures, such as bars, chains, specialized locks, or signs of body fixation, which aligned with the earlier assessment that any restriction of freedom, if present, was not carried out through direct violence or mechanical coercion. Instead, many small details in the spatial arrangement showed signs of subtle control over time and routines, no clocks displaying real time, all artificial light sources, using low-wattage bulbs positioned to avoid clear distinction between day and night, while items related to daily life such as dishes, cooking utensils, and the bed in the second area, all bore signs of use in repeating cycles with little variation. Investigators noted that the daily schedule here appeared independent of natural light and based on an artificial rhythm, which matched the time disorientation symptoms recorded in Timothy. Upon closer inspection of surfaces and items, the examination team collected numerous important physical pieces of evidence, including fingerprints, fabric fibers, shoe prints, and personal items not belonging to a single individual, indicating prolonged presence of multiple people in this space. Some items showed long-term use, but lacked high personalization, such as unlabeled clothing and generic household items, suggesting that users may not have had full control over personal possessions. In addition, investigators discovered several loose notes and simple markings on small pieces of paper, without specific dates, but showing repetition of daily activities, reinforcing the assessment that life here was regulated according to a fixed pattern. The area surrounding the cabin was also thoroughly surveyed, revealing signs of restricted external contact, no clear paths leading to main roads, surrounding vegetation allowed to grow naturally, obscuring visibility, and reducing the chance of detection from afar. Investigators recorded no signs of escape attempts or resistance at the scene, no damage marks or signs of struggle, which aligned with the hypothesis that control was maintained primarily through psychological and environmental factors, rather than direct violence. When summarizing the initial findings, the scene showed a living space maintained stably over a long period, with clear separation and access to comforts, an absence of visible confinement measures, yet the presence of many elements, limiting personal autonomy. The collected physical evidence was sealed and sent for analysis, with the goal of clarifying the connection between this space and Timothy Hale's physical and psychological condition, as well as identifying individuals who had lived in or visited here. The entire on-site examination process was carried out in accordance with forensic procedures, focusing on objectively recording every small detail, because even seemingly ordinary elements in the cabin structure and daily life could reflect how an enclosed environment, without needing chains or bars, could still maintain prolonged control over a person. From the physical evidence and data collected at the isolated wooden cabin, investigators began tracing the list of individuals with direct or indirect connections to the area, including land use records, prior civil reports, data from local ranger agencies, and information provided by the scattered resident community on the Yosemite fringes. The tracing process quickly narrowed the scope to a very small group of people who had appeared or been recorded as active around the area over many years, with one name standing out repeatedly across multiple sources: Darius Cole. Darius was identified as a middle-aged man who lived a cyclical vagrant lifestyle, with no fixed residential address in official administrative records, but who frequently frequented properties bordering the national park areas with low administrative oversight, where unregistered structures could easily exist. Investigators discovered that Darius had appeared in numerous scattered reports related to activities described as off-grid survival, a term Darius himself used when talking to those around him, to describe a lifestyle detached from mainstream society, independent of public infrastructure, and evasive of standard regulatory oversight. This history showed Darius had long-term experience living in remote areas, self-building or occupying simple structures, maintaining minimal living conditions, and minimizing contact with authorities as much as possible. Upon deeper review, investigators found that Darius had a record of administrative violations in multiple counties, primarily involving unauthorized residency on public land, unpermitted construction, unregistered resource use, and refusal to comply with administrative inspection requests. In addition, records noted several minor fraud-related incidents in which Darius was accused of using stories about survival skills, self-sufficiency, and the ability to break free from the system to persuade others to provide money, supplies, or support, though these cases were generally not serious enough to result in long-term criminal prosecution. Analysis of this data revealed a consistent behavioral pattern. Darius sought to maintain control over his living spaces by staying outside official surveillance, while building a personal image as someone knowledgeable and authoritative in enclosed survival environments. The connection between Darius and Timothy Hale gradually became clearer as investigators cross-referenced the timing of Timothy's disappearance with the periods when Darius was most frequently documented in the Yosemite Fringe area, as well as activity traces at the wooden cabin that matched habits Darius had previously shown in earlier reports. Several pieces of physical evidence collected at the scene, including fingerprints and personal items, indicated Darius's prolonged presence in the same living space, not merely short visits. When analyzing Timothy's statements about feelings of being controlled, fixed daily routines, and psychological dependency, investigators noted many parallels with the way Darius had described his own off-grid lifestyle, where rules were set by a single individual and maintained through dependency rather than physical coercion. Although Timothy did not name Darius in his initial statement, indirect descriptions of a person who decided daily rhythms, distributed resources, and limited contact with the outside world aligned with Darius's behavioral profile. Investigators also noted that Darius had interacted with hikers or tourists around Yosemite under the guise of sharing survival information, creating opportunities to approach solitary, less vigilant individuals. The intersection of activity history, violation records, physical presence at the scene, and the psychological elements documented in Timothy formed a logical chain of connections, sufficient to place Darius Cole as the primary suspect in the case. This determination was not based on a single piece of evidence, but on the synthesis of multiple independent data sources, from administrative records and scene evidence to behavioral analysis and temporal correlations. Once Darius was identified as the central suspect, the entire investigative direction was reorganized to focus on clarifying his role during the period Timothy Hale was missing, as well as how Darius's off-grid lifestyle may have created a control environment strong enough to sustain prolonged dependency without resorting to physical confinement measures. From the behavioral data, collected physical evidence, and prior psychological analyses that had already taken shape, clarifying Darius Cole's criminal motive was placed in the context of a highly personalized social isolation ideology, where separation was not merely a lifestyle choice, but became the foundation for establishing power. Investigators noted that Darius did not just avoid society out of dissatisfaction or fear. He actively constructed a narrative in which modern society was portrayed as the source of decay, deceit, and human control, while withdrawal from the system was assigned superior moral and intellectual meaning. In this ideological structure, Darius positioned himself as the one who sees through, the only person who truly understood the truth, thereby automatically claiming the right to direct the thoughts and behaviors of anyone who entered the living space under his control. Darius's need to control people did not manifest through explosive acts or direct violence, but through a carefully designed living environment where every essential element passed through his permission, from food, water, daily routines, to information about the outside world. In that environment, power did not need to be enforced through constant physical coercion, because dependency alone was sufficient to maintain the desired order. Timothy Hale, in a state of disorientation and weakness after straying from his hiking route, became the ideal subject for Darius to impose this model upon. Keeping Timothy was not the result of a premeditated kidnapping plan, but stemmed from Darius recognizing the value of that presence for the power structure he was maintaining. Timothy was not merely a temporary guest, but was gradually placed in a central role within Darius's closed world, where Timothy's compliance became the measure of the isolation ideology's effectiveness. Investigators determined that Timothy was held to sustain and reinforce Darius's psychological power, as each day Timothy remained equated to accepting the rules, interpretations, and limits set by Darius. Prolonged psychological manipulation was documented through Darius's continuous redefinition of reality for Timothy, sometimes exaggerating the dangers of the outside world with inflated stories, other times creating a false sense of security within the controlled space, causing Timothy to gradually lose the ability to compare and make independent choices. Periods of food scarcity, harsh weather, or information isolation were not treated as objective hardships, but were used by Darius as tools to reinforce the message that only compliance ensured survival. According to experts, this pattern created a form of psychological dependency, in which the victim no longer acted on free will, but on gradually imposed perceptual limits. Notably, there was no evidence that Darius sought direct financial gain from holding Timothy, no signs of systematic forced labor, no monetary transactions, no clear exploitation of resources for profit. The absence of traditional financial motives initially made the case difficult to classify, but when placed in the context of the need for control and personal power affirmation, the behavior became consistent. Keeping Timothy provided Darius with a sense of total control that he could not achieve in mainstream society, where power is dispersed and constrained by law. In the miniature world Darius created, Timothy was not only the controlled subject, but also proof of Darius's ability to break another individual's independence. Investigators also noted that maintaining Timothy's presence helped Darius avoid confronting his own isolation, as power only held meaning with an object to exert it upon. Timothy therefore became an indispensable element for Darius to sustain his own psychological structure. The criminal behavior here did not reveal itself in a single specific moment, but through a prolonged process where the boundary between helping and controlling was deliberately blurred. The core criminal motive was identified not in material benefit, but in the need to dominate perception, maintain absolute power within an enclosed space, and affirm personal identity through the dependency of another. Within that framework, Timothy's retention did not arise from a temporary circumstance or impulsive reaction, but played a pivotal role in sustaining and reinforcing the social isolation ideology that Darius pursued, causing the controlling behavior to gradually become a stable structural part of his life. Once this motive was clarified, the focus of analysis shifted to the practical ways in which that control was actually maintained, and investigators determined that the confinement process did not occur through direct violence, but through a deliberately organized non-physical control system, in which the gradual severance of contact with the outside world made the social world no longer exist as a viable option in the victim's perception. This process did not begin with immediate deprivation, but with small rationalized interventions, where every form of contact with the outside world was described as unsafe, unnecessary, or impossible under the current environmental conditions. Communication devices were eliminated, not through overt coercion, but through arguments about their uselessness in an area with no signal, the risk of detection, or how outside information would only cause confusion and weaken survival ability. As connection points were cut off, Darius Cole simultaneously built a tightly structured survival dependency framework, in which every essential element fell within his sphere of control. Food sources, water, tools, knowledge about weather, terrain and handling emergencies were not shared comprehensively, but provided in just enough amounts to sustain life without enabling Timothy to separate and survive independently. This controlled scarcity created a prolonged state of dependency, where each basic need became a psychological anchor, forcing Timothy to return to the established system. Within that structure, the concept of safety was systematically redefined, with every element outside the living space assigned images of danger, chaos and threat, while the controlled area was portrayed as the only place that could guarantee survival. Safety no longer meant access to help or freedom of choice, but compliance with the rules and remaining within Darius's sphere of influence. Control over personal decisions occurred through gradually narrowing options until every choice was steered toward a single direction, with alternatives dismissed through patronizing reasons or risk warnings. Timothy was not directly ordered what to do or not do, but every option was presented in a way that left only one seeming reasonable and safe. This guidance created an illusion of self-determination, while in reality, the decisions had already been pre-shaped by the controlled environment. Another key element of the confinement mechanism was maintaining a stable but prolonged level of environmental fear, with natural factors like blizzards, wild animals, rugged terrain, and the risk of getting lost continually emphasized as insurmountable threats without guidance. Stories of accidents, people who vanished, or those who never returned, were used as tools to reinforce the belief that leaving the living space equated to placing oneself in mortal danger. This fear was not provoked through extreme imagery, but through steady repetition, making it a foundational part of how Timothy perceived the world around him. In that context, confinement without physical violence became feasible and effective. There were no locked doors or guarded fences, yet all the psychological conditions necessary to leave were neutralized. Timothy could move within the permitted range and carry out daily routines, but the idea of leaving the controlled space gradually became linked to danger, failure, and death. The absence of direct violence made the surface-level relationship appear voluntary, while weakening the victim's own ability to recognize his confined state. Experts analyzing the case pointed out that this mechanism operated as a closed loop. Isolation created dependency, dependency reinforced compliance, and compliance was then used to justify maintaining isolation. With each passing day, Timothy's memories of the outside world eroded, not through overt denial, but through gradual replacement with new interpretations of safety, danger, and survival. Confinement in this case was not a single act, but a continuously maintained state achieved through perceptual restructuring, where the boundary between choice and coercion was blurred to the point of indistinguishability. Timothy did not stay because he was physically bound, but because every psychological factor had been arranged so that staying became the only seemingly reasonable option. The artificial stability of this state made the confinement mechanism durable, hard to break, and difficult to detect, even from the outside, where no clear signs of violence existed, yet the psychological consequences and loss of freedom were prolonged and profound. After Timothy Hale reached a state stable enough to participate in extended and continuous sessions, the investigative agency proceeded with completing the case file by recording a full, systematic, and tightly psychologically controlled statement to ensure accuracy and consistency. In these sessions, Timothy no longer described events through fragmented memory pieces as before, but presented a relatively clear chronological sequence of experiences, reflecting how he gradually lost the ability to make independent decisions in the environment controlled by Darius Cole. The statement focused on key transition phases from the initial contact, while in a state of confusion, to accepting the imposed daily rules, and finally to the prolonged psychological dependency phase, where every behavior was shaped by environmental fear and survival reliance. These contents were cross-checked in detail by investigators against physical evidence collected at the wooden cabin, including the layout of living spaces, signs of long-term use, functional area divisions, and items reflecting control over time, resources, and daily rhythms. The cross-referencing showed a high degree of match between the statement and the scene, especially in operational internal details that Timothy could not have guessed without actually experiencing them, such as uneven rationed food distribution, rigidly repeating schedules, and unspoken limits on movement range. The investigative agency continued comparing the statement to other objective data, such as weather records, realistic seasonal mobility possibilities, access to surrounding infrastructure, and long-term presence traces of both individuals in the same living space, thereby ruling out earlier hypotheses that Timothy might have voluntarily secluded himself or survived independently for an extended period. On the basis of synthesizing all the data, a continuous chain of criminal behavior was established, showing that Darius did not carry out an act of detention at a single moment, but maintained a prolonged control process through non-physical measures. This chain of behavior was clearly described in the investigation file, beginning with approaching an individual in a vulnerable state, continuing with information isolation, creating survival dependency, redefining the concept of safety, and sustaining environmental fear to reinforce compliance. Each element in the chain did not exist independently, but was tightly linked to the others, forming a stable control structure that gradually caused the victim to lose the ability to make independent decisions. The investigation file was finalized by integrating Timothy's detailed statement, expert conclusions from psychologists on the prolonged dependency state, scene analysis, and Darius's behavioral history over many preceding years. These documents were arranged in logical sequence to prove that the deprivation of liberty not only existed in its consequences, but was actively and systematically maintained by the suspect's intent. Prosecutors, upon reviewing the file, assessed that although there were no signs of physical restraint or traditional confinement, the elements constituting a crime were still fully present through psychological control, living environment manipulation, and long-term restriction of information access. Timothy's remaining could not be considered genuine consent, as alternative choices had been deliberately nullified, rendering the option to leave no longer feasible in the victim's perception. On that legal basis, the investigative agency determined there was sufficient evidence to charge Darius Cole criminally with prolonged deprivation of liberty through mental and living environment control. Procedural preparations were carefully made, from finalizing the arrest warrant to building a safe approach plan, based on verified information about the suspect's daily habits, movement areas, and tendency to evade contact with authorities. The arrest was carried out in full compliance with procedures, without confrontation or risk to involved parties, ensuring legality and safety throughout the entire process. The arrest of Darius Cole closed the prolonged investigation phase, in which all statements, physical evidence, and expert analyses had been systematized into a complete logical picture, clarifying how an individual could be deprived of liberty over a long period through mental control without the need for visible violence, while fully establishing the evidentiary basis for criminal responsibility. When the case file was finalized and handed over to the prosecutor's office, the matter entered a new phase where the focus shifted from gathering or verifying facts to presenting the proven behaviors before the court. Commencing the official prosecution process to charge Darius Cole with offenses related to prolonged unlawful deprivation of liberty and mental control that caused serious harm to the victim's right to self-determination. The indictment detailed the chain of criminal conduct established during the investigation phase, emphasizing the continuous, deliberate, and extended nature of the control process, while clarifying that Timothy Hale's remaining was not the result of free consent, but of a systematically constructed state of psychological dependency. During the trial proceedings, the central legal issue debated was the boundary between apparent voluntariness and subtle coercion, as the defense argued that Timothy was not confined by locked doors, restraints, or direct threats, and could formally leave at any time. The prosecution countered by arguing that freedom is not evaluated solely by physical mobility, but also by the ability to make independent decisions based on full and unmanipulated information, and in this case, that ability had been stripped away through prolonged psychological control. Before the jury, prosecutors systematically presented the behavioral and psychological evidence, including Timothy's detailed statement, expert conclusions on the prolonged dependency state, and analyses showing consistent control over information, daily routines, and perception throughout the extended period. Physical evidence from the scene was used to illustrate how the living environment was structured to reinforce Darius's power, from the division of living spaces and time control to the maintenance of dependency on essential resources. In particular, psychological experts were called to explain to the jury the mechanism of mental control, clarifying that a victim in such a state may not attempt to leave not because they consent, but because their perception has been shaped to view leaving as dangerous or unfeasible. The defense's counterarguments focused on denying criminal intent, claiming that Darius was merely pursuing an isolated lifestyle and that Timothy had voluntarily participated, while questioning the reliability of the statement due to the influence of psychological trauma. The defense also emphasized the absence of financial gain or traditional motives to argue that Darius's behavior did not fit the typical criminal pattern. However, the prosecution responded that criminal motives do not necessarily have to be material, and in this case, the need for control and domination of perception had been proven as the core motive, consistent with the behavioral evidence presented. The jury took time to evaluate the entire body of evidence, considering not only individual elements, but also their interconnections to determine whether a structured process of deprivation of liberty existed. The judges carefully analyzed whether an individual could truly be considered to have stayed voluntarily when all other options had been psychologically nullified, and whether the absence of physical violence equated to the absence of coercion. Throughout this process, the legal arguments were placed in the broader context of human rights and personal self-determination, where freedom is not merely the ability to move, but the ability to make decisions based on unmanipulated perception. After the trial arguments concluded, the jury reached the determination that the elements constituting the crime had been proven in a consistent and convincing manner, with the central focus being that prolonged mental control had paralyzed the victim's capacity for self-determination. The trial proceedings completed all necessary steps in preparation for sentencing, during which all arguments, evidence and evaluations were fully recorded, reflecting the case's transition from a complex investigation file to a trial process in which the sophisticated nature of the criminal conduct was brought to light through legal and psychological scientific analysis. After the entire trial arguments concluded, and both sides' final arguments were fully recorded in the case file, the jury began deliberations in a context where the case raised particularly complex legal questions, not based on familiar signs of violence, but on the nature of control and the limits of the concept of voluntariness. In the deliberation room, the jurors took time to review the entire body of evidence presented throughout the trial, including Timothy Hale's detailed and consistent statement, medical and psychological conclusions confirming the prolonged state of dependency, and analyses of the enclosed living environment, and the systematic way mental control was maintained over many years. The focus of discussion was not on whether the victim was locked in, restrained, or guarded, but on the core question of whether a person could still be considered free when access to information was cut off, all alternative choices were perceptually nullified, and environmental fear was continuously maintained as a tool to regulate behavior. The jurors analyzed each individual element, then placed them in overall context to assess the extent to which isolation, survival dependency, and redefinition of safety had combined to create a state of actual confinement, despite the absence of visible physical violence. After many hours of closed deliberations, the jury reached a unanimous conclusion that the elements constituting unlawful deprivation of liberty had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and the defendant Darius Cole bore criminal responsibility for that prolonged chain of controlling behavior. When the jury returned to the courtroom and the guilty verdict was announced, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavy, reflecting the gravity of the criminal conduct despite its lack of overt direct violence. On the basis of this verdict, the judge proceeded to sentencing with the reasoning that the case required a severe penalty proportionate to the prolonged sophisticated nature and profound consequences for the victim's personal freedom. Defendant Darius Cole was sentenced to 27 years in federal prison, with the court emphasizing that this was not merely punishment for one specific individual, but an affirmation of the legal principle that deprivation of liberty does not require chains or bars to constitute a crime, and that mental control can cause lasting harm, no less severe than any form of physical violence. In explaining the sentence, the judge clarified that the term was determined based on the continuous nature of the conduct, the comprehensive control over the victim's life and perception, and the long-term psychological consequences proven by independent expert evaluations. The court also considered mitigating factors presented by the defense, but concluded they were insufficient to alter the serious nature of the crime, as the prolonged control had fundamentally eroded a person's right to self-determination and dignity over many years. On that basis, the court ruled out the possibility of early parole, determining that long-term isolation was necessary to protect the community, ensure the deterrent effect of the law, and prevent the risk of similar conduct recurring in the future. After sentencing, all related legal procedures were completed in accordance with regulations, including recording the judgment in the federal justice system, establishing conditions for sentence execution, and fully notifying the defendant of remaining legal rights under the law. Although the right to appeal was duly noted under standard procedure, the court emphasized that the verdict was reached on a tight, consistent, and comprehensively reviewed body of evidence through multiple levels of evaluation during the trial. With these procedures completed, the criminal case was officially closed on the legal level, marking the end of a prolonged trial process in which the sophisticated nature of the criminal conduct was brought to light through legal and psychological scientific analysis. The court's ruling not only clearly established the defendant's criminal responsibility, but also affirmed that silent forms of deprivation of liberty, through manipulation of perception and control of the living environment, still inflict profound and lasting harm, even without visible signs of physical violence. When the legal process concluded, and the official sentence took effect, the focus shifted to a different reality, where Timothy Hale had to confront the personal consequences of the time he had lost, and begin the journey of reintegrating into society, in a life no longer shielded by legal rulings. Timothy had to face readjusting to normal rhythms of life, from seemingly simple things like flexible daily schedules and interacting with crowds, to making personal decisions without a fixed control framework dictating them. Experts noted that the sudden freedom after a long period of mental control could cause disorientation, anxiety, and stress, requiring Timothy a long time to rebuild a sense of safety in an open social environment. Alongside the reintegration process, Timothy was enrolled in a long-term psychological treatment program focused on addressing post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, overcoming the state of psychological dependency, and restoring his capacity for self-determination. The therapy process was not linear, but included phases of progress, interspersed with periods of recurring anxiety, avoidance, and insomnia, reflecting the profound depth of damage left by prolonged control. In therapy sessions, Timothy had to relearn how to recognize personal boundaries, distinguish between real dangers and fears formed in the controlled environment, and restructure his perception of the outside world as a space that could involve risks, but was no longer an absolute threat. Timothy's family relationships were also heavily impacted, as the long period of disappearance had created emotional gaps that could not be filled immediately. The family felt both relief that Timothy was alive, and the reality that the person who returned was no longer the one they had known before he went missing. The changes in Timothy's behavior, emotions, and communication style forced family members to adjust their expectations, learn how to support him without adding pressure, and accept that any recovery, if it occurred, would be slow and incomplete. Family therapists noted that this reconnection process required patience and understanding from both sides, because long-term trauma could not be erased simply by reunion. Timothy's ability to work was significantly limited in the initial period after his return, not only due to the physical consequences of malnutrition and harsh living conditions earlier, but also because of psychological issues directly affecting concentration, stress tolerance, and social interaction. Full-time employment was deemed unsuitable for a prolonged period, and Timothy had to access restorative vocational support, focused on rebuilding confidence and autonomy, rather than productivity. These limitations carried financial consequences and feelings of inadequacy, as Timothy faced dependency on medical and social support while desiring to reclaim an independent role. Administratively, the case file was officially closed after all legal procedures were completed, documents were archived per regulations, and the matter was classified as a case of prolonged deprivation of liberty through mental control. Closing the file did not mean closure on a human level, but only confirmed that criminal responsibility had been established, and the justice system had fulfilled its role. For Timothy, the long-term consequences continued to exist in everyday life, from anxiety reflexes when facing enclosed spaces, difficulties in making independent decisions, to a sense of loss over irrecoverable time past. Experts emphasize that recovery in such cases is not about returning to the original state, but about building a new one, where the victim learns to live with psychological scars without letting them define their entire being. The long-term consequences of the case, therefore, lie not only in the years Timothy lost, but also in the fact that he must spend the rest of his life rebuilding himself in a world that continued moving, while his freedom was taken away, underscoring that survival does not equate to full recovery, and that the aftermath of prolonged mental control can spread deeply and persistently more than any form of visible confinement. The story of Timothy Hale is not just an isolated case but reflects many very real issues in contemporary American life, where individual freedom is highly valued, yet subtle forms of control can easily be overlooked. Timothy was not tied up, not locked in, not threatened with physical force, yet he was still deprived of liberty for many years through isolation, psychological manipulation, and the redefinition of the concept of safety. This is precisely what makes the story especially thought-provoking for modern society. In the context of the United States, where more and more people seek isolated, off-grid lifestyles or withdrawal from the system due to distrust in society, this story raises an important question: where is the boundary between personal choice and manipulated dependency? Darius did not seize Timothy for money or grudge, but for the need to control, for the sense of power when another human being became completely dependent on him. This shows that the risk comes not only from traditional crime, but also from imbalanced power relationships, where one person holds information, resources, and the right to define reality for another. The lesson drawn from this story is in a society that prizes freedom, the ability to access information, maintain social connections, and protect personal self-determination is vital. When someone is isolated for too long, even under the guise of safety or protection, they may lose the ability to choose for themselves without realizing it. For today's American community, Timothy's story reminds us that freedom is not just the absence of chains, but also the right to access information, to choose, to make mistakes, and to leave. Protecting those things for oneself and for those around us is the most practical way to prevent similar tragedies in modern life. If you feel that Timothy Hale's story has helped you see more clearly the dangerous hidden sides of mental control and the true value of personal freedom, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring more haunting true cases and stories behind modern life together. Thank you for watching until the very end, and see you in the next video with another story where the truth is peeled back layer by layer and life's lessons continue to be told.